that's great. So let's see. So everything just uses the same. Alright, great.
You can't pre-
Okay, that one also uses that. And now we're gonna check Twitch. So we've been updating. We've been like messing with both of these for no reason. So how do I even, I don't even need to see that. Great. Everything is using that. Also, in all of these, I can move this up or something. I don't know. There we go. Okay, good. Great. Excellent. So we are all set. Okay, so we are reading Losing Ourselves, chapter 1. Yesterday we did the preface and acknowledgments for fun, and now it's going to be chapter 1. Um, who do you think you are? What a self is, and why you think you have one. And of course, the um, as the author Jay Garfield, who we're meeting with on the 28th, no big deal, says the whole point is the same reason, which I guess we don't repeat because it seems self-evident. Um, the whole point of all of this is that it is important to know ourselves. Um, that is, we think philosophically in order to come to know what kinds of things we are and how we fit into the social and biological world around us. So know yourself. And step one, understanding that you are not a self. Okay, so who do you think you are? What a self is and why you think you have one. What we mean by self. In a memorable passage from chapter 6 of Introduction to the Middle Way, also, as you know, called Madhyamakavadara, Kirti from 600 to 650 CE introduces us to the target of any critique of the idea of the self. He argues that it is important to keep that target clearly in view and that it is important not to confuse it with other ideas in the conceptual neighborhood. Kirti tells the story of a man who is afraid that a poisonous snake has taken up residence in one of the walls of his house. In order to alleviate his fear, the man searches the house for an elephant and satisfies himself that there is none there. He then rests at ease. But wait, wasn't he looking for a snake? So what is the moral of this odd Indian tale? Kondrakirti's, I don't know how to say that in any other way except with an exaggerated accent. Kondrakirti's idea is that even once we recognize that a conception or a commitment is causing us problems, it is often easier and more tempting to confuse it with another idea, to refute that other idea, and to leave the problematic conception in place. This is particularly true when we suffer from an irresistible compulsion to adhere to the initial problematic commitment despite the difficulties it raises. The serpent, in this analogy, is the self. Let me make this page a little bit smaller. Make sure everything fits in there. Pop, pop. Let's see how that looks. So Kondrakirti thinks that even a little philosophical reflection will convince us that there is something amiss in our thinking that we ourselves. But no offense to you lazy thinkers. Kondrakirti also thinks that the self-illusion undermines any attempt to understand who and what we are, and that this failure to understand the nature of our own existence and identity can be devastating to our moral lives. And I think the author and I agree with Kondrakirti. Yes, Indeed, the author does. I agree, he says. And Eris also says, I agree. For this reason, although the majority of this book is concerned with investigating the illusion of the self and defending the idea that we are selfless persons, in the end, it is really a book about ethics. I ask the reader to bear this in mind, and I promise that even though I may lead you through some thorny philosophical patches, the payoff will come when we return to ethical reflection in chapters 6 through 9. Kondrakirti argues that despite our ability to understand the incoherence of the idea of the self, we have an innate tendency to think of ourselves as selves. For this reason, he takes it that it is easier to respond to the philosophical unease arising from the self idea by rejecting some other position, such as that the self is the body or the mind or even the mind body complex, than to reject the self entirely. When we do this, we may reassure ourselves that none of these elephants are around. Oh, okay, the self is not the mind. Oh, okay, the self is not the body. Okay, great. But we leave the serpent in place in our conceptual scheme. So I am not a mind, I am not a body, I am not the mind body complex, but I still exist. And you exist as a person, but not as a self, not as a you in pretty much any way that you thought that you existed. Um, so he argues the first thing we must do is identify what this self is supposed to be. We thereby ensure that our analyses are directed at the correct target. Once again, I agree. Kandrakirti was writing in an Indian context, so the view of the self that he took as the object of negation in his argument, an argument which we will explore in chapter 2, is the view that to be a sentient being is to be an Atman. This term is usually and appropriately translated into English as self or soul. The idea that the Atman lies at the core of our being is ubiquitous in Orthodox Indian philosophy, and it was a principal target of Buddhist critique. I thought he was going to say it's a ubiquitous, period, because it is. But now that I see it's just saying it's in Indian philosophy, I'll take out the fucking. In the Vedas, and in particular the Upanishads, the texts that ground many of the Orthodox Indian philosophical schools, it is characterized as unitary, as the witness of all that we perceive, as the agent of all of our actions, and as the enjoyer of our aesthetic experience. Okay, so that's what the Atman is. Boom, 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 boom. I mean, it isn't. Doesn't exist. But anyway, that's how we think of ourselves. It is regarded as that which is always the subject, never the object, and as that which persists through life despite changes in body and mind. Okay? And which even persists beyond death and in transmigration. The Indian classic Bhagavad Gita, which is the Song of the Lord, characterizes the relationship between the self and the embodied person as akin to that between you and your wardrobe. Each day you might put on a new set of clothes, but you are still you, the bearer of those clothes. You are not in any sense identical to them, and you are the same individual who put on different clothes. Huh. Hello, the Sonic. Okay, it was frozen. Okay, great. Hello, the Sonic. Hello, Sonic fan. Each day you might put on a new set of clothes, but you were still you, the bearer of those clothes. You are not in any sense identical to them, and you are the same individual who put on different clothes yesterday and who may put on new ones tomorrow. Just so, according to the Gita, you, the Atman, put on a new mind and body in each life, but are never identical to any mind or body. Instead, you are the bearer of that mind and body, which are just as much objects to your subjectivity, as any external phenomenon. That you are this core thing, and the mind, the body, the building across the street are all these different objects to you, this subject. And also the other author that I'm seeing on the same day is, uses the word substrate about the self being this substrate of consciousness. And then when I interview people, I talk about possession Are you a brain, or are you the possessor of a brain, for instance? Okay, so your mind and body are instruments by means of which you know and act on the world, and they are therefore distinct from that self that makes use of those instruments. All right, so later, Indian philosophers such as Uritakara and Sankara present more systematic accounts of and arguments for the reality of this Atman. They argue that it is necessary in order to explain sensory integration, as in seeing the various colors in a butterfly's wings as constituting its variegation, or in assigning sounds, colors, smells, and other properties to the same object. Without a self, they argue, these would simply be independent sensory experiences with no common subject and so could not be assigned to any common object. They also argue that the self is necessary in order to explain the possibility of memory. I'm cringing at all of these. My remembering today what I did yesterday requires, so they flip and say, that the subject of the remembered experience and the subject of the memory are identical. Moreover, they argue that it is necessary in order to account for moral desert, since the one who is to be praised or blamed for any action has to be identical to the agent of that action. Our minds and bodies, they concede, change from day to day, violating the condition of identity. So neither mind nor body, they conclude, is a candidate for the self. The self must be something that stands behind both mind and body as the locus of our identity. We will return to these arguments in more detail in chapter 4. It is against the existence of this Atman that Khandrakirti's, there we go, finally, arguments are directed. Okay, so it is against the experience of this Atman that Khandrakirti's arguments are directed. And so, as we shall see when we return to those arguments, the Buddhist position, as we shall see when we return to those arguments, the Buddhist position, and indeed any no-self position, must assume the burden of explaining both the apparent integration of consciousness at each moment and our perceived identity over time in the absence of a unitary subject and agent. So those are challenges to us no-self people, right? We have to, because part of, as he mentioned, part of the justification one uses for belief in a self is the apparent unitary, let's say the apparent integration of consciousness, and our perceived identity as unitary. So he's going to explain why those things are either not real or do not necessitate a singular self. So in order to be successful, these no-self positions must show both that the idea of the self is incoherent and that everything that the self is meant to explain can be explained in its absence, can be explained a different way, okay? That is, the proponent of the no-self view must show that everything that the self is meant to explain can actually be accomplished by a person, a socially embedded human being with no self. So exciting. The Atman reemerges in another guise in Christian context as the psyche, another term usually translated as soul. In this context as well, the soul is held to be enduring and to endure even after death. Although in the Christian tradition, not through reincarnation, but instead through eternal reward in heaven or damnation in hell. Okay, so the psyche, like the Atman, is held to be distinct from and to be the possessor of the mind and body, the subject of knowledge, the agent of action. So again, the subject of knowledge, the agent of action, the object of moral approbation or disapprobation, which is that praise or, condemnation, and the enjoyer or sufferer of reward and punishment. Once again, philosophers worked assiduously to develop arguments for the existence and nature of this thing deemed so necessary by religious figures, defending its immortality, its simplicity, and its function as the unitary focus of experience and action. St. Augustine also argues that it is immediately available to us in introspection. And we saw that when we were doing the philosophy of psychology book about peculiarity. This idea that we might have direct access to ourselves, to self knowledge. Okay, where are we? Great. So St. Augustine also argues that it is immediately available to us, that self-knowledge is peculiar in introspection, and that it has the distinctive property of freedom, of exemption from causation in its active role, a property he deems necessary for moral responsibility, which, with our current understanding of reality, obviously makes no sense. But of course, that's not obvious to everybody. So Garfield hopefully is going to just lay that out really cleanly for you. So those like Hume and the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who argue in the Western tradition against the existence of the self. So that's great. Didn't know that Heidegger also argues against the self. Don't really know anything about Heidegger, but of course Hume, definitely. So those like Hume and the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, who argue in the Western tradition against the existence of the self, have this Christian version in mind as their target. For our purposes, the Indian Atman and the Christian psyche are close enough in content and are defended on similar enough grounds that we can often treat them as manifestations of the same broad idea. And because, I mean, all humans, we learned in Bruce Hood's The Self-Illusion that because we're social beings, because we exist among other persons, that we needed, for simplicity's sake, for predictability and so on, to think of ourselves as singular selves and this other person as a singular self, so that we can just put all their qualities, in one bag, and even try to, although it won't be super justified, to try to come up with a coherent sort of narrative about what that person is. What is their main thing that they want? What is their main thing that they're good at? What is the main thing that you can expect of them? Of course, we are much more varied and complicated than that, but complicated is hard. So we had to reduce ourselves to singular selves, each of us, so that we can kind of manage each other and our relationships to each other. It just makes it easier. So we all evolved that way. So of course you're going to see that be similar in the different traditions, because these traditions are much newer than us, our being social beings. Okay, so I would add that the difference between a religious view, according to which we are reborn, and one in which the afterlife is in heaven or hell, is incidental, and indeed that the entire question of post-mortem existence is irrelevant to the debate about the existence of the self, despite the religious context in which that debate is often prosecuted, and despite the fact that anxiety about post-mortem existence may motivate our belief in the self. But that's really just on top of our innate conviction to this idea of a self for pretty significantly the reasons that I just talked about being social beings. As we will see, this debate can be, and often is, pursued in an entirely secular register. You might think that the idea that our existence involves the reality of a self emerges in diverse traditions. The fact that it emerges in diverse traditions, you might think, is evidence for its correctness. Unless you heard what I just said about, obviously, we all evolved with this illusion. I hope instead to show you that this ubiquity is in fact evidence for a kind of innate tendency to succumb to a particular cognitive illusion. Okay, as Eris said, I hope also to show you that philosophical arguments for the reality of the self are only ways to ramify that illusion into explicit doctrine. And throughout this study, I will use the word self only to refer to this kind of self, reserving the word person to denote the complex, constructed, socially embedded, psychophysical complexes in which I will argue we really consist. Okie dokie. This is important. This is important. Sometimes people use the word self indifferently to refer to a self or to a person. If we are careful about the use of these terms, we can avoid confusion as well as a tendency to confuse merely verbal differences with real disagreements. The efflorescence of, in the West, of systematic argument for the existence of the self and of reflection on its nature, as well as for critique of that idea to which we return in Chapter 2, was the 17th and 18th century period known as the early modern period of Western philosophy. I want to be able to put myself directly in this. I'm just going to make an adjustment here. Beep, 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 beep. That's good. So now that's good. Okay. So we have this early modern period of Western philosophy where this guy uses a lot of big words, bro. Efflorescence. I think I was thinking effervescence. I was thinking I already knew this word. I do not. Effervescence is like, being temporary and shit. But this is about growth and blooming and well, I'm kind of guessing, actually. But I'm so confident in my guess that I'm just going to keep reading. The efflorescence in the West of systematic argument for the existence of the self and of reflection on its nature, as well as critique of that idea, was the 17th and 18th century period known as the early modern period of Western philosophy. Okay. Descartes famously argues in his Meditations on First Philosophy that we can be certain of our existence as res cogitans, or as thinking things, identical not with our bodies or our perceptual faculties, but with our faculty of abstract reason. Immanuel Kant, defending a position very much like that of many of the orthodox Indian schools, argues in the Critique of Pure Reason that the self is noumenon, a transcendental object existing outside of space and time, because of course we have to be magical. A pure subject or perceptual, conceptual, and aesthetic experience and agent of action, transcendentally free of the causal order. So, I mean, you're seeing a lot of people are talking about characterizing this self as, yeah, this just magical, extra material thing. The arguments and views of each of these philosophers have been addressed in detail by many scholars, and it is not my purpose here either to articulate or to criticize them, although we will return to them in Chapter 4, but only to use them to get a fix on the object of negation, to identify the self, that the existence of which will be the target of the arguments to come. And the first thing to say is that, like the white whale, belief in the self is fucking ubiquitous. It seems to crop up in some form in every major religion and philosophical tradition. We seem to be wired to experience ourselves as selves, just as we are wired to see the two lines in the Mueller-Lyer illusion as unequal in length, even when we know them to be equal. So I don't really want to, I don't know if I have like a, no, I don't, yeah, I know just what to do. Okay. Vertex to vertex, these things are equal. Okay, so now you know that, and still you look at it and it's like, they're not equal, bro. Okay. Right, but you are not a pure perceiver of reality as she is. So that you really believe that you have such a self, or are whatever. But wait, you might say, long dead religious philosophers might have thought that there was such a thing as a self, but I am a modern person. I think no such thing. I take myself to be nothing more than a psychophysical complex, what you, Garfield, want to call a person. So funny, I had a friend, or I guess I have, but we haven't been in contact. Our relationship was kind of brief. We started our friendship because he hit me up on Instagram, No. He just reacted to something. Anyway, details don't matter, except for this one. That I asked him what he thought of himself as, and he said that we are just a bunch of molecules, and that most of our, well, yeah, I don't know exactly what he said, but something about that our concepts are constructs, and well, of course they are. But so I don't remember exactly what he said, but that just a lot of shit is constructs. So that made me think that he really did understand. But then, when I was trying to, when we were trying to get into depth about what that meant, all of a sudden he's saying things like, "Oh, my brain tells me this." And he talks about how he says, when I would say that the self isn't real, the thing he had said on Instagram went out the window. And he goes, "How do you know your brain just isn't tricking you into thinking that the self isn't real?" What? Who do you think my brain's talking to right now? My brain, me. I am talking to you. This brain is talking to you. Um. Anyway. I could have just gone on quite the tirade there. So, but wait, you might say, long dead religious philosophers might have thought that there was such a thing as a self, but I am a modern person. I think no such thing. I take myself to be nothing more than a psychophysical complex, what you, Garfield, want to call a person. This is a common reaction, and if it were correct, I would indeed be attacking a straw man. So I now want to convince you that you, just like the Orthodox Indian philosophers, just like the Church Fathers, and just like Descartes and Kant, understand your own identity as that of a self. I will do that by means of an easy thought experiment, okay? Easy. Watch this, bro. So, one nice thing about imagination and desire is that we can imagine or desire anything, including that which is impossible. When I was very young, I wanted to count to the highest number, but of course, there is none. The natural numbers just keep going on and on. The great mathematician David Hilbert wanted to prove the completeness and consistency of arithmetic, something Kurt Gödel showed to be impossible. We might wish to live in the universes depicted by the artist of the impossible, M.C. Escher. We might wish to live in the universes depicted by the artist of the impossible, M.C. Escher, and so on. I say this because I'm going to invite you to imagine and even to desire something that might be impossible, and I do not want your sense that it is impossible to lead you to balk in following me in this thought experiment. Okay, great. So the experiment proceeds in two parts. First, think of somebody whose body you would like to inhabit. Maybe for a long time, maybe only for a short while, whatever. I won't ask you for the details or what motivates your choice. Some things are better left private anyway. But just to get the imaginative ball rolling, I will tell you whose body I would like to have. Usain Bolt's in his racing prime. I only want it for 9.6 seconds. I want to feel what it is like to run that fast. Now, in developing this desire, I do not want to be Usain Bolt. I want to be me. No, Usain Bolt has already achieved that, and it does me no good. I want to be me, Jay Garfield, with Usain Bolt's body, so that I can enjoy what Usain Bolt experiences. The very fact that I can formulate this desire or take this leap of the imagination shows me that deep down, whether correctly or incorrectly, I do not consider myself to be identical to my body, but rather to be something that has this body, or as I, Eros, would say, that is had by this body. Um, and that could, and so, okay, I'm just reading that sentence again. So the fact that I can even formulate this possibility of, having or being had by, whatever, Usain Bolt's body, shows that I do not consider myself to be identical to my body, but rather to be something that has this body and that in principle could have another one, such as Usain Bolt's. Once again, the possible incoherence of this desire or leap of imagination is beside the point. We know that we are capable of desiring and even imagining impossible things. In the present argument, I do not take it that it follows from these desires or imaginations that I actually am distinct from my body, any more than I think my childish desire to count to the highest number demonstrated that there is a highest number. And I think it was the dumbass Saint Aquinas who was like, oh, the fact that we have a concept of God demonstrates that there must be something like a God. But no. Um, so instead of thinking that this means anything about reality, I take the possibility of my forming this desire to show that I take myself, at least pre reflectively, to be a self that is distinct from my body. So the fact that I can think about this doesn't tell me anything about reality, but does tell me about at least what part of me thinks about reality. Okay? Just as my childish desire showed that then I took there to be a highest number. Now, for the second part, we can perform the same exercise, but now with respect to our minds. Imagine somebody whose mind you would like to have. Just for a little bit. And once again, whether this desire or act of imagination is coherent or not is beside the point. But I'll reveal my desire again. I would love to have Stephen Hawking's mind for long enough to understand general relativity and quantum gravity. But once again, this is not a desire to be Stephen Hawking, but to be me enjoying his mind. When you develop this desire, you do not wish to become that other person. Somebody else was already that other person, and that does nothing for you. You want to be you, but with their mind. And just as in the case of the body, the very possibility of forming this desire or imagining this situation shows that, correctly or incorrectly, you do not consider yourself to be your mind, but rather to be something that has that mind. Okay, don't want to be that guy, but I am going to be that guy. This experiment makes me nauseous, which reassures me that on most levels, I see myself to be like a mind. Um, you know what? Hold on a second. I just had a thought. I don't think I was trying to deny this. I do still sort of, at least part of me intuitively sees myself as a self, sees me as a self. Um, because when I imagine like taking an aspect of someone's mind and replacing it with an aspect of my mind, I still can imagine like a continuity. Um, yeah, but back to patting myself on the back, it is inconceivable to me. It is nonsensical. It is completely incoherent and unimaginable to me to have another mind. And maybe that's because I mean, that is because I've been thinking about this stuff long enough. Read Nagel, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, and contemplated that long enough to, yeah, for that to just be nonsense. Me picturing having the mind of a bat. That's what did I just say? I don't know that. I might as well have said. The point of these exercises is neither to argue that there is a self, nor to argue that there is not one, and no thought experiment could settle that question. That will be the burden of the subsequent chapters. No thought experiment could settle that question. Sometimes I get frustrated with philosophers or psychologists or philosophers of psychology doing thought experiments to get us to some belief of a self. Also, this is the best comment that I have gotten since I started live streaming last week. Excellent. So, I would love to have a conversation with you about why not, and also why. Um, or at least why reading that has to be complemented by like reading neuroscience. Okay, so no thought experiment can settle the question of the self. That will be the burden of the subsequent chapters. Instead, I remind you, it is to do two very specific things. First, it allows us to identify what we mean when we talk about a self. to identify what will be my object of negation in this study. Second, it is meant to convince you that the view that there is a self is no straw man. That is, I hope that it shows you that you, like nearly everyone except for the great Silurus, are convinced deep down. Oh, wait, no, I am also convinced that there is a self. I just, yes, no, okay, even me. That is, I hope that it shows you that you, like nearly everyone, are convinced deep down that there is a self and that this is true, even if you, like me, ultimately think that this conviction is false or even incoherent. So I think that, there's a part of me that has like a deep down conviction that there is a self. Um, but I do not, I do, like, at no level do I consider that distinct from the mind. All right, moreover, the very fact that you were able to follow me in this thought experiment shows that, at least before you think hard about it, you take yourself to be distinct from both your mind and your body, to be the thing that has your mind and your body, but that without losing its identity could take on another mind, another body, just like changing your clothes. The philosopher Janardhan Gneri correctly emphasizes that when we deny that there is a self in this sense, we are not re-identifying the self with the body and the mind. There is no self, just a body or just a mind, nor are we saying that the self really is the mind-body complex. We are denying that anything at all answers to the definition of a self. The mind cannot be located. Okay, evidence? Or I guess you would say that burden of proof is on me. Give me an aspect of the mind that cannot be located. And then the burden of proof will be on me to, well, locate it. Okay, so section, why we think we have a self. Before we go any further, we might well ask why most of us have this primal conviction that we are selves. Is this conviction the result of careful reflection, or is its origin more primitive than that? The Tibetan philosopher Tsongpa, I don't know, points out that while some people are convinced of this position philosophically, philosophy cannot be the origin of this belief for two reasons. Okay, great. So when we're talking about awareness, I guess we're also talking about like awareness of our own thoughts. So I won't be able to just say that it's the perceptual systems, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and so on. So let's see. The self is pure awareness. So I know I want to challenge the pure thing. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean. Do you mean that the self is only awareness? Is that what you're saying? Okay. In which case, so yeah, you're not saying that the self is like objective and complete and sort of unbiased or something awareness. You're saying that the self is only awareness, right? Okay. I guess my response would be that, but I guess it would depend on how much you accept about the brain. Because my first response is just like how unlikely it is given what we know about how distributed cognition is in the brain. So I would say that like you have to dissolve the mind and your thoughts. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, honestly, this is kind of the hardest thing to conceptualize or respond to. But here's what I'll just say in short is that I think if we start defining awareness, we're going to define it as engagement with mental processes. And there's no reason to think that the way that we process our processes is singular or it's like one thing. So that means that awareness is multiple things. It's composed of multiple different processes. There's not a single like process or a mechanism or entity or anything that like does awareness. Secondly, and I know these responses aren't great. Um, so yeah, I'm happy to have this conversation, especially to record it, so that I can have like a once and for all response to these ideas. Secondly, I do know that that is the your experience, this unitary sort of awareness, and everything else is outside of that. Um, but then it's like you're localizing it still. Like you're refusing to give it a location, um, but you are still saying that it is local in the sense of contained to something. Because what would the observation of these processes look like? No, I don't know. You know what? Yeah, I didn't. Okay, that's yeah. I'm gonna think more about that because nothing is coming to mind right now. But I definitely don't think it's justified. I do think that yes, it's your experience, but like nothing in what we've learned about the mind can actually support that. But I know that's not satisfactory. So yeah, let me. I'm gonna think about that and also look some stuff up and think about how to. So subscribe, and we'll have this conversation. Uh, okay. So anyway, so we're only like 2 pages away from the end of the chapter. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to say to you, that the perception that you're experiencing is not authentic, it is an illusion. So, like this sense of awareness, this is not an empirically founded thing, that you are awareness. Um, Not to mention, there's no receiver, there's no pure receiver. Every mental event, including awareness, including engagement with other information or other processes, um, is a constructor. Um, uh, Nothing that I'm saying is satisfying me, and I think it's because I'm trying to think of a single sentence that will respond to this, and I'm failing. So yeah, yeah, I'm just gonna have to think about it outside of this. Okay, or maybe if I just take a second. All right, so I'm gonna finish reading this chapter, and then I'm gonna try again. Okay. Uh, so why we think we have a self? Before we go any further, we might well ask why most of us have this primal conviction that we are selves. Is this conviction the result of careful reflection, or is its origin more primitive than that? The Tibetan philosopher Tsongkhapa points out that while some people are convinced of this position philosophically, philosophy cannot be the origin of this belief for 2 reasons. First, he notes most people are not philosophers and have never even reflected on this question. Nonetheless, they still believe that they are selves in the deep sense illuminated by our thought experiments of a moment ago. Even if they do not even if they do not, yeah, but here's the thing. So I've got this rule that I avoid discussions, exchanges, disagreements with people that are not showing the same skepticism of self that they are asking for. So you're suggesting to me a text from long ago, while I'm suggesting to you empirical recent research. feels like an imbalance to me. So, oh, you're gone. Okay. Even if they do not entertain this idea explicitly, it operates as a background self understanding that informs their lives. It therefore appears that philosophical conceptions of the self arise from, rather than give rise to, the sense of self. So they're just sort of post hoc rationalizations based on an intuitive conviction. And thank you. I also, it's too late probably. Okay, the second reason that philosophy can't be the origin of the belief in the self, Tsongkhapa argues, is that even philosophers who are convinced through philosophical argument that there is no self, as I am, and as I hope you will soon be, do not escape this atavistic sense of being a self. And it is worth emphasizing that our instinctive sense of self that enables us to imagine having another body or another mind, and these philosophical defenses of the reality of the self address one and the same self. Philosophy in this case is trying to make sense of our intuitions, not substituting a philosophical self for an intuitive one. For this reason, I suspect that the explanation of the self illusion is not cognitive, but is instead emotional, or even simply biological. Oh, okay, great. Because this no. So I guess he's using here cognitive not as just any like mental event outside of emotion, but as higher cognition. So he's like excluding instincts from this cognitive thing, which okay, that makes sense, and that's pretty often the case. There may be good. Taoism is considered a form of non-dualistic philosophy, closely aligned with the concept of Natsu Advaita found in other Eastern traditions like Zen Buddhism. So, by the way, I also want to say something else. I do really want to investigate this because I want to write a paper this year, sort of tracking man's search for self. So, thank you very much for this. For these comments here, and I hope that they are being, I don't think they are being embedded in the video. Okay. So I'm just going to write them down, I guess. Okay, very good. All right, thank you, friend and partner. So there may be good evolutionary explanations of its origin, just as there are almost certainly good evolutionary explanations of how our visual system evolved to succumb to the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Each of these may be, as the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould called them, spandrels or byproducts of traits that have real survival value, even if being duped by these illusions has no survival value in itself. But such speculations are well beyond the scope of this book. I would guess the self-illusion arises from a confluence of biological and social causes, but its origin is less important than what motivates our present belief in the self. I don't know, I'm going to disagree with that for sure. Also, like, these aren't in the same category. You can have social causes because of our social needs, the explanation I gave earlier, that made certain biology more adaptive, such as our biological instinct of having or being a singular self. And I think that the origin could be important, could be really important. Because if you know where it came from, doesn't that tell you a little bit about the thing that it's, the thing itself and where it's going to be most resistant to updating? The 9th century Indian philosopher Santideva argues in How to Lead an Awakened Life that our conviction that we are selves arises from a primal fear of death, and that we construct the idea of a self as a bulwark against that fear. Santideva also argues that the idea that we ourselves arises primarily in emotionally charged situations, as when we perceive that we have been harmed or when pride is aroused. I think this is kind of related to the point that I was just trying to make. Because I was talking about predictability. One of the most important reasons to be able to predict what other persons around you are going to do is because they might harm you, and you need to be able to predict that. Um, Thank you very much, and hope to chat again with you. Anyway, let's finish this chapter and see whether I can come up with anything about the stuff that my friend and I were discussing. Okay, so it is then that we think not of our minds or bodies, but of we who possess those minds and bodies. David Hume adopts a similar view. He argues that the thought that we ourselves is a product of the passions, that we posit the self as the object of pride and humility and then reify it in thought. If anything like these analyses is right, the idea of self is grounded not in reason or perception, but in affect. I find the view that affect is the origin of our sense of self plausible, though perhaps not directly demonstrable. This idea in turn suggests that the universal or near universal drive to posit a self is instinctive, built into our nature as human beings. So there you go. That's I think the best way to put it, and probably even just maybe just leave it at that. That fact, if indeed it is a fact, would be an explanation but not a justification of the view that we are selves. It would be like the explanations of why we are susceptible to perceptual illusions, an explanation of our tendency to error, not a proof that what we think we see is real. But once again, to explain the origin of the psychological processes that generate this illusion, and to explain how those processes actually give rise to the conviction that we ourselves, we would have to turn to psychology, to biology, and to the social sciences. In the next few chapters, I will present reasons to think that we are not selves. I take this task to be important and not simply an abstract metaphysical inquiry. This is because the self-illusion matters. It matters in part because it obscures our own identities from us, leading to a profound misunderstanding of who and what we are, and of the degree to which our own identities and existence are bound up with those of others. And it matters because it generates a perverse moral vision that engenders an instinctive attitude of self-interest and egoism that none of us can rationally endorse, and from which we would happily free ourselves. In chapters 6 through 10 of this book, we will address these important consequences of the self-illusion, and we will consider what it would be like to experience ourselves, others, and our world free of that illusion and of its pernicious consequences. I hope that by coming to liberate ourselves from the self-illusion, we can lead better, happier lives, and I undertake this investigation guided by that hope. Okay, so what do I respond? What are some ways I can respond to people's conviction should have used a different source for this. All right, so what do I respond? What do I think? I need pen and paper. And we're gonna put this in, not this one. Where did I put it? Where's the notebook for this? For this stuff? So we'll put it in the YouTube notebook. Oh, right here. Great. All right. So, oh, I should put that back on, and we can just put it on top. Ba 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 ba. All right. So this should be 2026 Alpha 20 Bravo. So self equals pure awareness. What are my issues with this idea? Um, okay, so let's see. I don't know how good each of these responses is going to be yet, so I'm just going to let stuff come out. One, this seems cheap, but might be valuable. So, awareness is the act of awaring. Okay? Awareness is a noun in the sense of it's used grammatically as a noun, but it's an action. It's not a thing. I think that that's a problem. Awareness is an action, but what is doing that action? Okay, so it's still so the self is obviously a noun in the sense of being an object. Well, but being the subject. So the object that awares, right? That's what the subjective is, right? It is the object that awares. Okay, so then, but so it seems to me that that you're giving us a verb, right? The act of, some verb. Whereas the self is supposed to be an object. Um, the object that does this act. So that's one objection that I have. What that you still haven't told me what the object is. Secondly, second problem is that it seems to suggest that awareness has no mechanism. Right? That this, and this relates to the first thing. I think a problem with talking about an object as being an action is that you're saying that this action can happen without an object. In which case, you're not going to be able to tell me about any of the mechanisms. All right, let's leave the first thing aside. Maybe let's not try to relate it. Maybe what I want to be my second point here about you know what? So I'm glad that the word pure was included because I think that makes it easier. Everything, every action is a process. Okay, so we have the action of awareness. Every action is a process. It's they're events, and those processes, those events, have to have origins. Oh wait, no, my mistake. I forgot that I'm interpreting pure awareness as being that the self is only awareness. No, but I think there is this. I mean, there's definitely this aspect in Indian philosophy, in parts of Indian philosophy, that awareness can be pure, that it can be objective, that it can receive things as they are. But how could a protocol, a process like that ever develop? Um, and are there other variations of that as that was developing? Is there such a thing as impure awareness? Because maybe you're just saying that like the human self has achieved or is capable of achieving pure awareness, um, but that there are impure perceptual or awareing processes. Like if like it's like the awareness process didn't undergo development. I don't know about this one. And then the last one, and then I'll end the stream, leaving it just at these thoughts. The last one is, I'm going to take it from a different angle. Um, that the self is pure awareness, or that pure awareness is even a meaningful term, is what I call a natural compulsion, a NACO. And um, I don't know what this is called to argue something this way by saying like, okay, so I'm talking about the origins of the belief. So you in particular, or or anybody who believes that may have gotten it from a reading, but most likely it also already existed in them, and that's what made the reading so appealing, right? I mean, there are two kinds of people that look at ideas. There's two ways of, let's say, evaluating ideas. One, you can look at it as how much does this like work for me, like how much does this seem true, and then the other way is to be empirical about it. What do the data say about this idea? um, this is clearly one in the first category, where evidence doesn't matter so much. So whenever someone makes a claim, expresses a belief that is like pre-programmed, that is something that we intuitively believe, you should be really skeptical of it, because typically if someone makes a claim, you might think, oh, something brought them to that claim. But with natural compulsions, we know what brought them to that claim was genetics, and that is not a reason to believe a thing, just that it was encoded. So when someone believes in a natural compulsion and doesn't, give evidence for it, the only evidence that you have that this might be true is the fact that they are insisting on it. Well, that insistence gets canceled out by the fact that, of course, they would insist on it. It is an intuitive conviction encoded in us. So I'm definitely gonna want to discuss this with the professors of philosophy that I am seeing on the 28th. This question, and so subscribe so you can see what more we come up with to respond to that. Thank you, my fellow risers.